So just to introduce myself, I'm Dan. I live up in North Yorkshire. I come from London originally, but moved up to university at Leeds and sort of stayed up there. Moved slightly further north to Knaresborough. I adopted a little boy, so we moved up to Knaresborough for that because we were living right in Leeds city centre. And I'm an author. And I'm a playwright, so I've probably written about 20 or so different plays. I run a children's touring theatre company, and also I'm involved with a sort of collective of artists who do more contemporary performance. And most recently, I've got a book out, which is like a kids' YA book called Rise of the Shadow Stealers. So I'll mention that again in a bit. And the sequel to this is currently with the editors and should be coming out in the next few months. So yes, I'm gonna spend a bit of time introducing you to some of the work that I do. I was talking to my wife, sort of saying what I was going to do. I said I'm going to start off by talking about all the things I do, and she said you might come across as being a bit arrogant if you just start off talking about yourself for 20 minutes. But the reason I'm going to do that is, I guess, to give a bit of context to when we then come on to look at sort of stories. You'll know where I'm coming from and some of the things that I've done, and hopefully when I talk about why stories are important, it will make some sense in the context of what I've been doing. If people have got questions at any point, do just stop me and ask questions. I like to be asked questions. I get quite nervous about just sitting and talking, so if anyone does want to ask questions, feel free. I think I wanted to say, I guess, in terms of being here at Speak Peace Festival, I see myself as an activist, as an artist. I think of myself, I think primarily as an artist. You know, that's how I want to engage in the world. That's how I want to see things transformed in myself and the people I work with and the communities that we then work with. And I think I was reflecting on maybe some of the differences between being an activist and being an artist. I think sometimes if you've got a very strong sense of what you want to say and what your message is, the arts can be used as a tool to say something. I want to say this, I'm going to use the arts as a tool. I guess that's not quite where I'm coming from. I think I see the arts as a way of learning. So actually I go into the things that I make not necessarily knowing the answers, having a sense of themes, having an intuition about something, and then sort of pursuing that as a way of working out what I think, and in conversation with the people that I'm working with. And also the arts is something that invites people into it to sort of journey with it. So I think I wanted to sort of say those two things to begin with as I start to talk about what I do, because I think the arts is or certainly the stuff I do is not necessarily always very direct. It can be quite indirect, and it's as much about what you're hiding and not showing as about what you are showing. We're going. So maybe there are just some things to bear in mind as I talk through some of the performance stuff that I've done. And also just maybe have a think about the common threads and the things that link up some of the projects and performances that I'm going to talk about. So yeah, I'm going to spend the first part just talking about some of the performance projects I've done, the book that I've written, some of those different things. Then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about story and why story is important and why we tell stories. It's not something we really reflect on very often, why we tell stories. But the more I've looked at it, the more deep I think it is in terms of who we are as humans. We tell stories. That's something we do. But when you think about it, it's quite a bizarre thing. So we'll spend a bit of time looking at why we tell stories. And then at the end, I'll come to my sort of latest project, which is the Stories from the Forests of Leeds. And if we've got time, we'll have a go at making a quick character. I hope that's okay. So it is sort of me talking a bit more than us all sitting down with a pen and writing stuff. But hopefully there might be some things you can take away at the end to, carry on writing with. And I'll try and keep my eye on the time as well. So, to start off with, I'm going to talk about the project where I think I first met Louise, who's just sort of come into the room there at the right time. It was a project called Tales from the Great North Road. And on the surface, it was a story about 3 medieval pilgrims who break away from Chaucer's group of pilgrims who meet at the Tabard in London, ready to go down to Canterbury. But my 3 pilgrims fall out with this group of pilgrims and decide to travel north instead, up to St Andrews and up to the very edges of the earth. And at the time, St Andrews was the very edges of the earth. And as they travel along the Great North Road, which at the time wasn't the A1, it was, you know, a windy little road. As they travel along that road, they get caught up in the different folk tales that are found along that road. So they meet King Arthur and Robin Hood and St Helen, who's the mother of Constantine in York, and they get caught up in these stories, and it's about those stories. On a deeper level, what the project was about was I was quite interested at the time of the idea of Christendom, of the church being allied with power, and how at the moment we're moving away from the church being allied with power. We're moving from the centre of society towards the edges. And so this journey was a journey from the centre, from London, to the very edges of the earth. But we were looking at these stories, these Christendom stories, which assumed that the church was sort of at the centre. You know, if you read Robin Hood, if you read things like King Arthur, Christianity is sort of at the background and the centre of those stories. And we were asking, do those stories leave do they leave something behind? Do they mark the places where those stories are told? Do they shape the culture now? And what do we do about that? What do we do about the stories that are left? And it ends up, actually, these 3 pilgrims end up getting killed off. Oh no, they kill the narrator at the end, these three pilgrims. And I've actually just rewritten it. But at the beginning, they were left at Ghosts to wander sort of aimlessly. And it was a bit of a... the ending was a little bit ambiguous and a little bit hopeless even, maybe. You know, they were just... They were left as ghosts, like these stories are left as ghosts. But I've just rewritten it with a sense of actually inviting the audience to become the narrators of these characters' stories. So they've killed off the single narrator and they hand over narration to the audience and they say, well, how are you going to write us? How are you going to input to our lives? So that was Tales from the Great North Road. And I guess I saw it as a sort of prophetic action, that we actually walked the same route that our characters walked. And we turned up at the same places on the same dates that they did in the story. So they travelled over the month of August from London going up to St Andrews, and we travelled over the whole month of August going from London up to St Andrews, and we performed their story on the way. And then we made video stuff and we journaled, and we looked for where do these stories have sort of resonance now? Do they leave a mark? And also, the idea at the time was I was looking at the idea of pilgrims and travelling in companies. So we were also looking at, we were travelling as a company. So I came at it as a Christian, but as a Christian who was maybe questioning the place of Christianity and of the church in society. But not everyone in the group was Christians. There were people from lots of different backgrounds, and it was also about us travelling together as a group and talking to each other and eating together. And we had an open invitation for anyone to come and join us on the journey. So different people came and we spent time in different places, and that all became part of the story in a sense that we were telling. We were also telling this story as we walked. That became a story in and of itself. And the other thing just to mention is we were also experimenting with spontaneous performances as we went. So we did book places where we were going to perform. So we performed at Lindisfarne Priory. We performed at an inn called the George Inn down in Southwark. We performed on the street in York. So lots of different types of places, Sherwood Forest. But we also, one of my favourites, we stopped in this little village called Mooka in North Yorkshire, and we got chatting to the people in the pub who said, "Oh, there's the older people in our village meet together in the village hall on this day. They'd love to hear this story." So we sort of said, "Oh, we'll come and do it." So we did spontaneous performances, and I guess I wanted to offer something to the places we went to in a sort of a sense of generosity. I think often when you're doing arts and you tour, you go to somewhere, you do the same thing and you move on, and you don't necessarily engage in that place or that space. And I think I was wondering how you do that. Can you still do that where you travel and you engage with a place and you listen and you learn from it and then you speak into that space? So that was the first project that we did. That was a big sort of touring project, journey project. The second one sort of carried on from that. It was a project called Leonard's Bones, and we travelled along the coast. So in the first project, we travelled from the centre to the edges. And this second project, we decided we're going to travel along the edge, along the coast. And again, listening, what can we discover about the coast? What can it tell us about our culture? And the original idea came from a dream. I had a dream about a pirate who was half French and half English, and he was called Leonard Lebec. And he'd conquered St Michael's Mount, which is a little island off the coast of Cornwall. And I discovered just after that there's a French island called Mont Saint Michel. I don't know whether that was in the back of my head somewhere, but I'm also interested in the connections you suddenly find as you make work. But for me, Leonard was someone who transgressed borders. So he was quite a political figure. Was he French? Was he English? You know, he lived on both sides of these sort of enemy nations. And he did a lot of moving boundaries, moving boundary stones around and that sort of thing. So we travelled along the south coast. And we took the spontaneous thing a little bit further in that we didn't book anything for this tour. We each came up with a story about Leonard, that each person in the team made their own story and sort of had their own angle on who Leonard was and made a story about that. And then as we went, we just tried to perform it in different places. So we did a random performance of Punch and Judy and Leonard on the beach in Brighton by the burnt out pier. So you've got the sign saying danger, and then we set up the Punch and Judy booth in the middle. We did a performance outside Nelson's ship in Portsmouth, which is actually a military base. So we did one on a campsite, like instead of the redcoats. So these very random sort of performances, but I guess trying to access and connect with audiences who maybe wouldn't come into contact with this work. And then as we went, we also created Leonard's story. So we had these little performances, and then we stopped in places and we said, if Leonard was here, where would he be and what would he be doing? What are the bits of history here that he might connect with? What are the legends that he maybe has met someone from that legend? And we basically set up this thing called the Society for the Promotion of Pirate Histories. And we were from the Society for the Promotion of Pirate Histories, promoting this pirate Leonard. And as we went, we sort of filled in his story, and the aim was that we came up with walks that people could do to find out about Leonard and who he was. But we presented it as if it was truth, and it's quite interesting what people will take as truth if you print it on a flyer and you give it out. Even the National Trust place in St Michael's Mount took in a whole bunch of flyers about Leonard and how he'd conquered the island and he'd lived there, and they put them in the National Trust shop in that area. So I guess that's quite playful, but also thinking about truth and story and, what we take as fact and what fiction is, and how fiction maybe interweaves and changes the course of factual history. On that journey, I guess we came up with a sort of process of listening and then mapping and then speaking. So as we were travelling, we were listening. The mapping was the telling the stories. How are we going to tell this story? How are we going to shape this place? What things are we going to draw out? And then finally we did a performance up at the Edinburgh Festival, which was a documentary performance about that journey. So we told the story of that journey. And it sort of became about heroes and what we project onto heroes and how heroes become a discussion, a place of discussion for a culture. Because each of us, coming from our different place, our different maybe worldview, projected certain things onto Leonard. So for me, he was this political guy moving boundaries. For someone else, he was quite sexy, and he was 6'4", and he moved very stealthily. For someone else, really picked up on his sexuality. So different people projected onto this character, Leonard. And through that, we as a team started to talk about our values, what we had in common, and what we maybe disagreed on. And we talked about how do you run a company when you maybe don't share the same values? You know, how do you define... And for me, with this whole thing of moving out of the centre to the edges, I really didn't want to impose anything. So how do you hold a space where different people can define that space and say what it's about? I've got a little bit of script to read you from it. Where is it? It's over here. So this is from the Edinburgh show. And it's mainly written by one of the performers called Ellie. But then other people chip in, so I'll try and make it obvious where the other people are chipping in. So Ellie says, I'd been to some of the places we visited on the journey before, and with one site in particular, downright insisted we visit, and we did, almost. We reached a quayside, and just a small stretch of water separated me from the place I had spent so many holidays. I took my first steps there. But we'd arrived too late, and I had to go up north for the weekend, leaving the remaining company to explore. I felt like that about much of the journey, not quite there. Like what we had uncovered were not the bones themselves, but something less direct. We've been having a bit of a sit, and I've been having a pray and a think and reflect about where we are on the journey and what my reflections are of it so far. Each morning, as I woke to the smell of collective body odour and perhaps the remnants of fart that all mingled in the tent, I could be in no doubt that we were on a journey together. But while we were on a journey together, the differences between us emerged or became heightened. I found joy in discovering or being allowed to discover the weak points of others, and I knew that I was in no way exempt from this process. I ran. I struggled to articulate what I was thinking in particular. I suppose I was just wondering about the humanity of it all. We were creating a myth, but for me, this myth was really the place where our differences were illuminated. We gained ground geographically and emotionally. We came on the journey with our own rituals, praying or using hair straighteners. We created new rituals, Becky swimming or the quest for tea towels, to name just two. The sea speaks to me of tides coming in and out, of life continuing, of life, death, birth and resurrection, of blessing where there's been cursing, of the sea washing away all that isn't good. Leonard was like our baby in a way, if babies could be 6'3" with a bit of stubble. We tried to fill him with all our ideas on faith, politics and sexuality. He spoke of what we needed or wanted as a group, a small group admittedly, but I invite you to think about the wider implications. What needs do the heroes and villains of our own culture spring out of? Having made that invitation, I instinctively returned to the small. Perhaps our pulling in different directions with Leonard has left a space in the middle for something else. The Spirit of God, humanity, relationship, refining fire, mystery and fun, your interpretation, not knowing is much less scary as a child. So that was a section from the play which I think hopefully shows some of that thinking, both of how we're travelling as a team and growing as a team, and also how we're making those connections to society, to heroes, and how we have that bigger discussion. Don't want to say anything else about that. So the third project we did sort of moved on from that again and took this idea of similarities and differences and wanted to explore that in a wider way. So we ended up pushing a boat around Yorkshire for 100 miles. Over a period of a month, it was a project called Heave. And basically, we wanted to explore what the values of Yorkshire were. We wanted to ask people what was important to them. So as a little group, as a team, we'd been having that discussion. What's important to us? And hang on, we sort of agree about that, but we disagree about this. How do we expand that to our audiences? So we talked a lot about, we started off with travelling players moving around, pulling a stage, and then we talked about what other things could we move around or push around. And we came across this idea of a boat. And the boat is a symbol of community, like the Ark, a little group that are together and have to be together and have to sort things out on the way. But also the boat is a symbol of moving between different communities. So for this project, we decided to make a big list of all of our values. So we've got this huge list, and then people signed up, the team signed up to the values that they agreed with. And whoever had signed up to that particular value made a very short bit of performance about it. So like a 1 minute or 2 minute performance. So for instance, one of the values I signed up to was playfulness, which saw me dressed as a big yellow duck, leading impromptu games of pin the tail on the duck at Bolton Abbey. I don't know if anyone's been to Bolton Abbey, but there's stepping stones across the river. So you can imagine me dressed as a duck around the boat, going across the stepping stones, being chased around by random people playing this game. And the idea was we did this bit of performance, and then we invited people, we asked people what was important to them, and we got them into conversations about what was important to them. And from those conversations, we then asked them to write on the boat what was important to them. So as the boat moved round, it became this sort of symbolic... you could look at it and you could see the values of the region. You could see little discussions and debates happening. You could see self-censorship. So we talked about, is there anything someone would write on the boat that we would want to take off, that we wouldn't want to be on there, that we wouldn't want to push round? And actually there was only one incident where a little group, and someone wrote something up that was quite offensive. But actually the group he was with then self-censored. So they then said, you shouldn't write that, and they actually scrubbed it out. So that was quite interesting, because we decided in the end we would walk with whatever people wrote. And the other thing that I found really interesting was whether we were pushing the boat through an industrial estate in Bradford or across the hills in Addingham, which is, the Yorkshire Dales, very nice, just a few scattered houses. One of the things that really struck me, I was expecting to find people's values to really be very different. But actually, people say remarkably similar things in terms of what they value. And I guess what we were doing as we asked people is we were giving people a reflective space for them to think about, did their lives reflect the values that they were articulating? And I think that's what a lot of people said to us. So the person who works at Bolton Abbey, who has sort of hosted us, she said, I feel like I've been slapped in the face. She said, I think we get life all wrong. We don't make enough space just to be together, just to talk together, to slow down. And I think that sense of giving people space to reflect was really important. We weren't going saying, think this. We were going creating a space for people, for that natural humanity to arise and people to articulate that and then reflect on that. And that was a really interesting process. Another couple of thoughts from it. Also, we at the very beginning, we gave lots of flyers out, and we were trying to get people to come over to the boat. It was built on a caravan chassis, so you could push the thing round, and we camped next to it. We stayed in people's houses and businesses and schools and all sorts of things. We tried to get people to come to it, but we felt, again, that was quite imposing. And actually, we decided what we would do is we're pushing it down people's streets. We just decide we'll stop, and whoever comes, they're the people we'll engage, they're the people that we'll talk to. So there was something attractive, naturally attractive about it. People would come and say, why are you pushing a boat up my street? What's that about? And from that, you can then get into conversation. And it was really interesting. And the other thing was, we had loads of health and safety. I had to sit with 3 lots of police forces and I think 2 highways agencies from 2 different counties explaining that we were pushing this boat around on the roads, and we had an open invitation again for anyone to join us push this boat around. So, I'm sat in with these 12 quite large men who obviously like, what, you're pushing a boat, Northern then, you're pushing a boat around. What's this about? Is it for charity? No, it's not for charity. We're not doing it for charity because that would put a certain value on it. It's an arts project. Oh, right, okay. So anyway, we did that work, and we had lots of health and safety in the end, which was a real shame. But it sort of had to be done. But one of the things we had to do for it was think about what we'd do if we got trouble from irate drivers or, groups of kids or whatever were going to jump on the thing. And we had quite a few things that we had to consider around that. But over a whole month, we only had 1 incident. And reflecting on that after, I think that the idea of pushing a boat around was disarming. Because it was playful, it was quite hard for people to be angry with it. So one of my reflections was actually the absence of conflict as we pushed this thing around. And actually, we did hold people up. We did have queues of traffic behind us. We did. And there were people who came out and said, what are you doing? And we'd just explain it, and they'd go, oh, I don't know what's all that about. I don't agree with that. But you could then have that conversation, and it became part of the process. We filmed it, the journey, so I've bought some DVDs, and if anyone wants to take one, you can just come and have one at the end. One of the nice things, this has got in it some of the things people wrote that they valued, and we took figureheads, so people we met, we took photos of them stood in front of the boat as the figurehead. So we've got lots of pictures of people, very different types of people, all stood in front of the boat being the figurehead of the boat. So if you want to grab one of those after, do. So moving on from that, something a little bit different, which I'm not going to talk a lot about, is my book. So that's quite different. So I've moved away slightly from these big touring journey projects, partly because my wife and I have adopted a little boy, so it's quite hard to go away for a month. So personally, I've moved a bit more towards writing, and I've had this book come out called Rise of the Shadow Stealers, which is a children's book, and I'm quite interested in how you talk about philosophical or spiritual things for kids in a way that's fun and interesting and not necessarily simple, but where the story is simple enough to open up wider issues, I think, and wider horizons. So that's what I'm trying to do with this. And also, I think, for me, writing is a way of processing my journey, my individual journey with faith and the church. I'm particularly processing through this book. So it's about 2 apprentice adventurers with missing memories. And they wake up on a place called Full Stop Island, Blotting's Academy, which is the place where all story characters go to be trained. And they wake up in this place and they can't remember who they are. And the book is them going on a quest to discover who they are, to recover their missing memories. And as they go, they sort of get caught up in the life of a character called the Storyteller, who's quite an interesting character to write, and I guess is the God sort of character in it, but also isn't. So that's me trying to, I guess, express some of my story, some of my journey in that indirect, symbolic way. So not everyone who reads it might get that, but maybe I would have conversations which, again, would then be able to open that up. I think one of the things I wanted to say, again, was, for me, with the arts, if you can start with something that's not what you're trying to say, I think it gives you a greater ability to connect. So I think if you've got something you want to say and you start with that, the risk is you end up talking to the people who agree with you, because they're the people who are going to identify with that story. So initially, before doing Tales from the Great North Road, I often started in the past with a biblical thing, something like that, and I'd write about that. But I moved away from that to saying the thing that I'm going to write about, the connection point, is a road, or is the sea, or is a boat. So they're ways that people can access something, and then from that access point, your character then naturally comes through. And I found that, I think, a good way of connecting a wide range of people that I maybe wouldn't normally connect with or meet with. And the very last thing I'm going to talk about is this book called The Leeds Story Cycle, which does a similar thing. So this is a group of short stories that I wrote with lots of different community groups around the grande part of the Tour de France, which set off from Leeds. So we worked with a group of asylum seekers, a group of recovering addicts, a young person's theatre company, a group of retired folk from an Anglican church, a group of students, so quite a range of people, and each group created a character that reflected their group and then told a story about that character making a journey into the centre of Leeds on the day of the Grand Depart. Some of them were going because it was the day of the Grand Depart and they were going to that. Other people were just going into Leeds and it happened to be that day and they got tangled up in that. And then the seventh story is those people all being in the same moment at the same time when the Grand Depart sets off. And each of the stories happens along the spoke of a wheel going in towards Leeds. So you can sort of, I think there's a picture, yeah. So you got a map of Leeds with a wheel sort of put onto it. So I quite like this thing, which is structures that help you tell a story, again, which is like maps, that mapped the city in a certain way on that day. I've got a few copies of this if people want to have a look at it as well. So that's some of the work that I've done. I've spoken probably for longer than I was going to about that. So I don't know if anyone's got a quick question now, or I can leave maybe questions to the end and it can maybe merge into lunch. At the end. Okay, at the end, says the video guy. Okay, so yeah, I'll leave questions to the end, but if you've got questions, do come and ask. So I wanted to talk about a little bit more about stories and why we tell stories. So I got a question for you. What is a story? I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts. What is a story? That's right. Yeah. Go for it. Yeah, cool. You do get in touch as well if you're up near Leeds. We can always have a chat. Okay, cool. What is a story? Yes. An experience. It can be an experience, definitely. Someone tells a story and that's an experience, yeah. Yeah. Something with a start, a middle and an end. Excellent.
A classic definition would be a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it.
Okay, yeah, so there's conflict in a story. There's someone who wants something. There's a desire. There's an experience. It's the life of a human articulated. Yes, so it's something that catches the life of a human. Any other, just a couple of others?
Just a recounting of something that happened.
Yeah, okay, so a story can be trying to be a factual or accurate recounting of something that's happened.
Images or ideas around a narrative.
Yeah, okay, so it might be something that we picture, that we imagine. That's probably quite a big part of it.
And it could be a non-judgmental way of telling truth.
Yes, yeah, so it's a way of telling the truth. A non-judgmental, that's interesting. One of the interesting things to me about stories is we all know what a story is. So that's an odd question to ask, what is a story? Because we all know what a story is. And all people tell stories. Which, again, just to reflect on that for a minute, people from every culture tell stories, and people of every age tell stories, from the little baby that sat on your lap that you're telling the story to an older person recounting the stories of their lives. Everyone tells stories. Everyone has this process of imagining a series of events that is not now, but is something that either happened or hasn't happened, but I'm imagining in my head. That's something that all humans do. So there's something very human about telling stories, and there's something very connected, something that can connect people about telling stories. Very briefly, the three main theories of telling stories is firstly that story is a representation, it's a mirror of the world. So the world is like that and we tell a story and it mirrors it, and with that there's a focus on plot and structure. Secondly, telling a story is a discourse. It's a way of talking, and the emphasis there is on point of view. Who's telling the story? Why are they telling the story? What's their agenda? And the third one is reader response theory, which is that stories are a social interaction. So I don't own the story, you don't own the story. It comes alive in the space in between us, and it's different each time it's told. So it's a communal, it's a social thing that exists in between us all. Story, I'm going to read a couple of quotes from a book called Stories of Change, Narrative and Social Movements, edited by Joseph E. Davis. And he talks about story and meaning. And he says, story is the main way that we use to create meaning. So if I was to say, she refused to move and let the man sit down. She refused to move and let the man sit down. Okay. Some people may already have a story in their head there, but that could be something that's just happened in London and it's fairly meaningless. Someone refused to move and let someone else sit down. If I said it in the context of other events, other stories, so Rosa Parks triggered a wave of protest which snowballed to become the civil rights movement in America when she refused to move to let a white man sit down on a bus in Montgomery. Okay, suddenly that event has got a lot of meaning. I've said it in the context of a story, and an event which could be absolutely meaningless has now taken on a huge amount of meaning. So he says, narrative is the primary form through which human experience is made meaningful. The primary form through which we make our experience meaningful. Narrative is a meaning structure that organises events and human actions into a whole. So that's a big thing. We organise stuff into a whole, therefore attributing significance to the individual actions and events according to their effect on the whole. So story is a way that we give significance to events because of the way they connect to the whole, because of the way they connect to other things. So I don't know if you've ever had an argument with someone where you both remember it totally differently. Has that happened? You're like, this is what happened, and they're like, that isn't what happened. This is what happened. I think most people have had that experience. And I guess I wonder whether that's because do both people approach that event with a different story in their head, and therefore they've attached a different meaning to that event. They maybe haven't even seen that event. They haven't even noticed it. It's been invisible to them. Stories also have what's called a valued endpoint. So this is the place that the story's going. It's the culmination of the story, but it's also it's also often the place where you draw out the point of the story, or the moral of the story, or the theme of the story. And in a well-formed story, that meaning is sort of immanent throughout the story. So it's not that you get to the end and you're like, oh, where did that come from? You know, that has been sown all the way through. And it's the valued endpoint that helps us select what events we're going to tell in that story. So I do an exercise, I was going to do it, but we haven't got time, where I get people to tell each other their life story in a minute. You probably already know what sort of story you'd tell in that minute. Most people have it in their heads. Maybe not. We could do it later. And then I get people to retell that story, but they're not allowed to refer to any of the events they mentioned the first time. And that's much harder. But interestingly enough, generally the second telling of the story is more interesting. generally the first time you sort of say the things you've got in your head, the things you've said before, this is what I'm going to tell someone when they tell me this. The second time you're like, oh, what am I going to say? And you need to dig down a little deeper. You need to get under the skin of things a bit more. You maybe pick a different valued endpoint, a different way into the story, a different angle on it, and you tell it from that angle. You might pick up on different details. So these valued endpoints guide our selection of events, and they guide where the story is aiming. Because of this, stories shape our sense of what the future should be or could be. So again, this is another quote. It says, stories reconfigure the past, endowing it with meaning and continuity, and so also project a sense of what will or should happen in the future. So things have happened in this way. I know this story. Things have happened in this way, and therefore this is what should happen in the future. Yeah. So stories can either restrict our sense of what happens in the future, or they can open up possibility for us. And that works on the level of individual identity or in terms of groups. So individual identity, historically, identity is like a fixed essence. It's something you're given. Yeah, you are this person, you're given this identity. Whereas more recently, psychologists looking at narrative identity look at narrative as the way of understanding who you are. So you are your story. And that emerges through selection and implotment. So in our own lives, there's certain events we remember are very high on our horizon. We see them clearly. And there are other events we forget or become small. And that can work positively or negatively for us. So the recovering addicts that I was working with, what they're doing a lot of the time is they're replotting their stories. They're looking at certain points and they're saying, actually, maybe that wasn't as important, but this moment or this thing I need to rediscover or refine, and I need to tell my story and understand myself in a different way. And that's something that people do through therapy, that sort of thing as well. But it's something we all do all the time. And these are the basis, these narratives of how we represent ourselves to someone else. And then you've got group stories. So this is when the I stories change into we stories. And you get what are called bundles of stories. And these bundles of stories have certain motifs in common, or certain structures. So think of X Factor. The stories that are told on X Factor, you expect them to have a certain progression. Something's got to be quite difficult in the past, and music, this is the way that they're going to find freedom and the way out of that thing. They're the motifs of that story. And by telling the story in that way, it's seen to be authentic. And that works for all sorts of different communities. So going back to Rosa Parks, within the civil rights movement in America, one of the motifs was spontaneity. It was a spontaneous sit-in. She spontaneously had this action of not getting up, not moving for the white man to sit down. So, and that's how, in a community, stories are judged to be authentic. And often then you can then begin to shape stories in a way to tell them so that they have these marks to be recognised. But actually, Rosa Parks had been an activist for 20 years, so there was a lot of stuff going up to this moment, this spontaneous moment on the bus. But we draw out that moment because that's one of the motifs that makes these we stories seem more real or more authentic. And because of this, you have interpretive communities come around these stories. They constitute and reaffirm them. And a collective memory comes about through implotment and rehearsal of stories. So going back to some of the travelling stuff that I've done, that's sort of what we were looking at. We were going to places and we were saying, what stories have been told? How does that shape the culture? What if we told them differently? What if we change them slightly or change the meaning of them slightly? And are there ways that we can actually make new myths for a place, new legends that would actually give places a different sense of character? Last thing on this, I wanted just to talk about the difference between a logical argument and a story, because we picked up on story as a way of telling truth. Another way of telling truth is by giving a logical argument, but they're different ways of accessing truth. So I'm just going to go through some of the differences. So a logical argument appeals to the intellect, whereas a story appeals to the whole being, to the imagination, to the emotion, and to the intellect. A logical argument is about deduction and reflection. So you have certain things, and from these premises, I deduce this conclusion. Whereas stories we've touched on are more to do with identification. They're more to do with stepping into a story, identifying with a character, and they're to do with intuition and suggestion, and they're both moral and aesthetic. Okay, so they're slightly softer and gentler than the sort of logical argument. For a logical argument, you often need specialised knowledge. You need to understand the background to the argument. That is true of stories as well, I think, but it's less true. Generally, there's no need for specific specialised knowledge. With a logical argument, causality and truth are made explicit. Okay? So if you're making an argument, I know what I'm trying to say to you, and I'm being explicit. This is what I want. This is the conclusion I want us to reach. Here, I've set it out. With a story, selection, causation, and significance are not directly displayed. They're hidden. So that's both, that can be positive and negative. There are times when you should be saying explicitly, this is the argument. But there are other times when you're inviting someone to participate and identify. With a logical argument, it's testable and debatable. So you can say that's wrong because that's wrong. Whereas with a story, it's much more difficult to challenge because it's imaginative and it's emotional. With a logical argument, there is a clear and previously thought through position. Whereas with a story, it's ambiguous. There are tensions, it's undecided, and it's seeking. So I think, for me, it's going back to some of the things I said at the beginning about how I might approach truth or working with truth or wanting to see change as an artist might be different to how you might make a campaigning argument where you want to set everything out explicitly. Just some final thoughts from me in terms of using story. So it's indirect. It uses symbols. The starting point isn't always what we're trying to say, but that can filter through. And it's to do with learning. So you don't always start with the answers. You start with questions, and it's about learning and learning together often. It's, I think, about connection. So not preaching to the converted, but finding the places where lots of people can access, and then the discussion and the shared learning can happen in that space. And I guess I want to appeal to people to go with intuition, go with the things they're attracted to, the things of their subconscious, because I think, like going with the dream about Leonard, that can often lead you to that place of connection, I think, more than maybe if you come trying to impose something. And maybe the last point there is to start, for me, telling a story or working with performance, you're starting with the personal. And this is something I've been learning, I think. The more personal I am, the more universal it feels what I'm saying is. If I try and start with the universal, if I think I want to say this about the world, and I'm going to try and say it to you, generally I don't think it works that well. If I start with the personal, whether it be about my own sense of brokenness or darkness, and then connecting with someone in that and then talking about that, that's where I find actually you tap into something that is universal, that connects well beyond where maybe you'd expect it to connect. So I guess my plea would be to go with the personal, to go with intuition, and dig down into that stuff if you're doing creative things. Not to feel you have to say something, but to follow the threads and see where they lead. Because if your heart and your character's in the right place, they will lead to interesting places, I think. We didn't get on to Stories from the Voice of Leeds. Actually, can I just finish by reading one piece from that? Is everyone okay? It's a poem. So this is... We made our characters using place names. So Bagley is a place in Leeds, and this is the Bagley Bagman. So we basically said, take a place. This is something you could do. Take a place use it as a name, and then just intuitively come up with a character that fits with that place name. So this is the Bagley Bagman. And I got people to write a sentence about that character and then develop it into a little piece about the character, talking about forests. So we're imagining Leeds as a forest, and imagining what stories and characters would emerge from the forests of Leeds. So this is a poem not written by me, written by an author called Oz Hardwick, called The Bagley Bagman. Bagley Bagman. In a cave where water drips, echoing like snapping bones, the Bagley Bagman hefts his black sack, slaps it across his back, moulds it to his shoulder and slouches into the wet morning. Something tied inside wriggles and whimpers, so he whistles loud to drown the sound and soothe his twitching nerves. What is it? He doesn't know, has never dared to untie the twine that winds around its ragged neck. Yet somehow he can't resist the twist in his fist, the awkward scuffling up his spine, though he could do without the wine that follows him everywhere. The air smells of oil, wet dogs and licked peppermints, and the trees rustle like sandpaper on old cardigan as he shuffles through the sludge but leaves no footprints, green eyes on the ground and his mind on shopping. Stopping, he stutters, mumbles and mutters. What's in my black sack? Don't ask. You've got chocolates from Thornton's, Harvey Knickknacks and a HMV DVD. But what's in my black sack? Not saying. You've got shoes from Shoe, shampoo from Lush, a brush from Boots, books from Waterstones. Listen to the waters on the stones. Shush. What's in my black sack? You don't want to know. You've got long johns from John Lewis, Samuel Silver, sweets from Smith's and a top from Topshop. Stop. What's in my black sack? I don't want to know. There he goes, slow, shuffling, muffling the mewling from his black sack as best he can, pretending it's not there. And when people spot him, they stare, but never dare to stop him, and he never cares to catch their eyes. Why? Because he knows the weight he knows the weight he bears cannot be shared or cast aside, however much he tries, and he can't. No, he can't turn the clock back to that cold, dark night on the twisty track when he stumbled across that fat, black sack. So that's the Bagley, quite a dark story, that's the Bagley Bagman, but a lot of what's come out, because Leeds is a big shopping city, is about shopping and about the haves and the have-nots, the people who go unnoticed. So we're going to be producing a book of stories from the forests of Leeds, which will be illustrated and have these stories and poems in. And that should be out next year at some point. So, yes. But thank you for coming and listening, and hopefully you got something from that. And if people have got questions now and want to hang around and ask me questions, let's do that now.